Mississippi's racial history against African Americans. Mississippi is deeply saturated in a legacy of terror against the African American people, and what makes racism such a evil, complex system, even its influence on the psychology of the races, what makes it so sickening is not only the atrocities, the murder that is committed against the victims, but also the lack of accountability, the lack of progress, and anytime you have crime and evil of that nature that is not held accountable or addressed, it just evolves. Human beings, just think about children. If your son or daughter commits an act of theft, or maybe they're engaging in some sort of bad behavior, and as a parent, you do not establish any clear rules or boundaries or consequences for that behavior, do you think that child, as it matures, is just naturally going to stop that behavior? Do you think that child is just going to instinctively autocorrect or self correct that behavior? No, they're going to engage in that behavior more and more. And that's what you see with the case of racism is many white people who engage in racism towards black people, and I'm sticking on just these particular groups, they haven't had really, white people really haven't been given any massive, not even incentives, any massive sort of collective accountability, or no legal system or government has put into place any conditions where white people have been forced to look at themselves and address the histories of racism that they have sort of perpetuated against African Americans. There's nothing that has really been set in place. Hate crime laws and hate crime bills would have been a good start to protect the black community, but there really hasn't been anything set in place to keep white people accountable and for them to answer for their racism against black folks. They really haven't, white folks haven't really had anything, because even the police force, the criminal justice system as a whole, even the United States government, the FBI, the CIA, all of these different entities are so convoluted with white people who have some of the same ideologies, belief systems, and hatred towards the African American community, where even these systems they don't have enough sort of momentum to even keep their own communities accountable. So Mississippi has a very deeply entrenched racial history, and the fact that none of this has been accounted for or addressed, or there hasn't really been any accountability or massive push to keep white people um, even legally accountable for their hatred, it just, doesn't surprise me that you still see cases like a Nolan Wells and many others as we go through some of these racial histories. It's no surprise that these cases exist in this particular state. So the history of state sanctioned and systemic racism Racial terror and state level complicity in Mississippi is one of the most thoroughly documented chapters of American history. From post Civil War legislation to the height of the Civil Rights Movement, these historical facts are backed by legislative records, judicial confessions, federal investigations, and academic data. So, the systemic and codified oppression in Mississippi. Systemic racism in Mississippi was not merely a matter of personal prejudice, it was explicitly written into state law to maintain white supremacy and subjugate African American emancipation. So, you have the Black Codes, 1865. Immediately after the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, Mississippi became the first state in the nation to pass the Black Codes. These laws criminalized Black unemployment. They called it vagrancy, prohibited African Americans from owning land outside of cities, forced them into highly exploitive labor contracts, and made interracial marriage punishable by life imprisonment. The Mississippi Constitution of 1890, state leaders openly admitted that this constitution was designed to strip Black citizens of the right to vote. The president of the Constitutional Convention, Saladin Calhoun, stated, "We came here to exclude the Negro." It established poll taxes, subjective understanding clauses, where white registrars decided if a voter could properly interpret a portion of the Constitution, and literacy tests. The impact on voting. The systemic barrier of the 1890 Constitution was devastatingly effective. In 1890, African Americans made up the majority of Mississippi's population. Yet within a few years, Black voter registration fell from over 140,000 to less than 9,000. By the 1960s, only about 6% of eligible Black Mississippians were registered to vote. State funded segregation. The Sovereignty Commission in 1956. The Mississippi legislature created and funded the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. This state agency used taxpayer money to spy on civil rights activists, coordinate with the white supremacist citizens' councils, and maintain files on tens of thousands of citizens in order to actively subvert integration and Black voter registration. Racial terror and lynchings. For decades, extrajudicial violence was used as a tool of terror to prevent African Americans from seeking economic independence, legal rights, or political power. The highest number of lynchings in America. Historical databases maintained by the Tuskegee Institute and the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, document that Mississippi had the highest number of recorded lynchings of any state in the nation. Between 1882 and 1968, Tuskegee recorded 581 lynchings in Mississippi. The Equal Justice Initiative data. Modern documentation by the EJI focusing on racial terror lynchings, killings carried out to enforce racial subordination, confirmed at least 654 lynchings in Mississippi between 1877 and 1950. Systemic impunity. In almost 100% of these cases, the white perpetrators face no legal consequences. Corrupt local sheriffs and all-white juries routinely ruled that victims met their deaths at the hands of persons unknown. Even when lynchings were highly publicized, pre-announced, and attended by thousands of spectators. The civil rights movement in Mississippi was met with extreme, deadly violence carried out by white supremacists, often with the active help of complicity of local law enforcement. One, the murder of Emmett Till, August 28, 1955. 14-year-old Emmett Till was abducted, tortured, and murdered in Money, Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. His killers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, were acquitted by an all white, all male jury in just over an hour. Months later, protected by double jeopardy laws, both men admitted to the murder in an interview with Look magazine. 2. The assassination of Medgar Evers, June 12, 1963. Medgar Evers, the field secretary for the Mississippi NAACP, was shot in the back and killed in his own driveway. In Jackson, by Byron De La Beckwith, a member of the White Citizens Council. Two all white juries deadlocked on Beckwith's guilt in 1964, allowing him to walk free for 3 decades. He was finally convicted of the murder in 1994 based on new evidence. The Neshoba County murders, June 21, 1964. Civil rights workers James Chaney, a black Mississippian, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, both white New Yorkers, were abducted, tortured, and shot to death in Neshoba County. They were investigating the burning of a black church. The conspiracy to murder them directly involved Neshoba County Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price and other members of the Ku Klux Klan. Because the state of Mississippi refused to prosecute anyone for murder at the time, the federal government had to step in and try the perpetrators for federal civil rights violations. The murder of Vernon Dahmer, January 10, 1966. Vernon Dahmer, a prominent NAACP leader who offered to pay poll taxes for black residents who could not afford them, died after his home in Hattiesburg was firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan. Dahmer defended his family with a shotgun while they escaped the burning house, inhaling lethal amounts of smoke in the process. The legacy of law enforcement and judicial complicity. A defining characteristic of Mississippi's history of racial violence was that the line between white supremacist hate groups and the official legal system was virtually non-existent. The Ku Klux Klan and police intersect. Prominent law enforcement officers, judges, and local politicians were active members of or sympathizers of the KKK and the White Citizens Councils. All white juries. Because black citizens were systemically barred from registering to vote, they were also legally barred from serving on juries, which were pulled from the voter polls. This guaranteed that any white person accused of a crime against a black person would be judged solely by their white peers, ensuring near total legal immunity for racial violence for nearly a century. State-sanctioned terror, the Goon Squad, convictions, 2024. In one of the most severe cases of modern police brutality prosecuted by the federal government, 6 former white law enforcement officers in Rankin County, Mississippi, who referred to themselves as the Goon Squad, were sentenced to massive federal prison terms. The incident. In January 2023, the officers entered a home without a warrant, handcuffed 2 black men, Michael Corey Jenkins and Eddie Parker, subjected them to racial slurs, beat them, shot them with tasers, sexually assaulted them, and forced them to drink liquids. The mock execution. One of the deputies placed a gun inside Jenkins' mouth and pulled the trigger in a mock execution. The gun discharged a live round, shattering Jenkins' jaw and nearly killing him. The systemic cover-up. The officers immediately fabricated a cover story, planning a throwdown, gun, and drugs on the victims to justify the raid. The legal outcome. After a federal civil rights-led investigation, all 6 officers pleaded guilty to federal civil rights conspiracy, deprivation of rights, and obstruction of justice. In March 2024, the U.S. District Judge Tom Lee sentenced the former officers to combined federal sentences totaling 132 years. 2. The dilution of black voting power and gerrymandering. Systemic battles over the political disenfranchisement of black Mississippians remain a major focus of federal litigation today. Federal court rules Mississippi Supreme Court map violates the VRA. In August 2025, a federal district judge ruled in White versus Mississippi that the state Supreme Court voting districts violated the Voting Rights Act of 1965, despite Mississippi's population being nearly 40% black, the highest percentage of any state in the nation. Only one of the nine states, only one of the nine state Supreme Court justices was black. The court ruled the map unconstitutionally diluted black voting power. Side note, in 2026, a federal appeals court vacated the immediate redistricting mandate based on a separate U.S. Supreme Court ruling, returning the battle back to lower courts under a higher burden of proof. Supreme Court challenges to legislative maps. In 2026, Mississippi state legislative maps faced direct legal challenges under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Plaintiffs argued that the Republican drawn district maps systematically split black populations across multiple districts to weaken their collective voting strength and preserve white political dominance. 3. The disenfranchisement of felons, permanent stripping of voting rights. Mississippi has one of the most punitive felon disenfranchisement laws in the United States, originating directly from its white supremacist 1890 Constitution. The current law, under Section 241 of the Mississippi Constitution, individuals convicted of certain crimes lose their voting rights for life, even after completing their full prison sentences, parole, or probation. The racist origins. The original list of disenfranchising crimes was deliberately chosen in 1890 because white legislators believed black people were more likely to commit those specific offenses, such as burglary or bribery, while omitting crimes they believed white men committed, such as murder. The modern day impact. Today, this law disproportionately disenfranchises black Mississippians. According to data from the Sentencing Project, Mississippi disenfranchises roughly 15% of its entire black voting age population, the highest rate in the country, compared to just under 6% of the white population. The Jackson court system in Hinds County legislation. This is 2023 to present. 2023, the Republican-led Mississippi legislature passed House Bill 1020, a law that civil rights organizations and residents of Jackson, Mississippi challenged in federal and state courts as a racially motivated power grab. The demographic context. Jackson is Mississippi's state capital and the largest city. Its population is over 80% black. The law, HB 1020, created a new separate Capital Complex Improvement District, CCID, court system within Jackson where judges and prosecutors were appointed by state officials who are predominantly white and Republican, rather than elected by the local, mostly black constituency. The modern court rulings. Local residents, represented by the Mississippi Center for Justice, the ACLU, and the NAACP, sued in late 2023. The Mississippi Supreme Court struck down the portion of the law requiring appointed circuit judges, ruling that appointing judges violated the state constitution. However, portions of the law expanding state control unelected police presence, portions of the law expanding state controlled unelected police presence over parts of Jackson were allowed to proceed. Racial discrimination in jury selection. The systematic exclusion of black jurors by white prosecutors remains an active issue before the highest courts in the nation. The Curtis Flowers case in 2019 in Flowers versus Mississippi, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the death sentence of Curtis Flowers, a black man tried 6 separate times for the same crime by the same white prosecutor, Doug Evans. The Supreme Court ruled that Evans had engaged in a relentless, determined effort to systematically strike black jurors from the jury pool, violating the Equal Protection Clause. The Terry Pitchford case, 2026 and late 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court took up yet another Mississippi death penalty appeal, Pitchford versus Kane, centering on jury selection bias. Over half of the original jury pool in Pitchford's trial was black, yet prosecutors, again led by DA Doug Evans, struck nearly all of them, resulting in a jury with only one black member. So, of course, we have now present day the Nolens Wells case, where there has been some challenges with the jury selection and controversy at the origins of the case. Now the investigation is ongoing and the evidence will be presented to a grand jury. So Mississippi has a very deeply entrenched racial history. And this is the education and the knowledge that the African American youth need to understand when you are putting yourself in environments where you or are the minority. You need to understand the context and the environment of who you are dealing with.